Well, thank you very much. I am delighted to talk about higher education this afternoon. We've done some extraordinary things, and I think we have some extraordinary things that we need to do. And I think we are facing some extraordinary challenges, not only in Texas but nationally, that I hope we can make some progress on. And after I outline some of these issues this afternoon. As we survey the landscape of public education in Texas and around the country as we approach the end of 2017, it's difficult to come away with a sense of unqualified confidence in the future. The Washington Post noted recently that Americans increasingly consider American education elitist, politically correct, and here's a quote, often a failure at providing graduates practical skills for the job market. A Gallup poll from this past summer found that only a third of Republican voters had confidence in universities, regarding them as too liberal or too political. A Pew Research Center survey at about the same time found a similar result, with only 36% of Republicans approving of the current state of higher education. For your information, 72% of Democrats regarded higher education favorably, but of course they didn't win the big election last year. Other surveys show that large majorities of white working class men do not believe college degrees are worth the cost, and that others believe universities are havens for, and I quote, damn crybabies and spoiled brats. This decline in public confidence in higher education in Texas and nationally comes at a time when tuition and fees have risen and state support has declined. Adjusted for inflation, states spent $5.7 billion less on higher education in 2016 than in 2008, despite an enrollment growth of 800,000 students nationally. The third factor in determining college affordability is family income, which with the vast majority of families in this country has remained flat. So the national picture is this: state support on a per student basis has been steadily declining, and the cost of tuition, fees, and books has gone up dramatically, and this is another quote, vastly outpacing income gains, according to one source. Texas follows the national pattern less severely for many families. The cost of attending a public university in Texas is right at the national average, and our community colleges are the third least expensive in the country. In addition, funding for the state's chief financial aid program, Texas Grant, has gone up steadily since its inception in 1999. Certainly the most disturbing fact about higher education in Texas and around the country is it is no longer the reliable engine of social mobility that it once was. Think of the Morrill Act, for example, in the 1860s. Think of the GI Bill at the end of World War II, which created the greatest expansion of the middle class in the history of this country. In fact, you could argue that higher education is likely to entrench social disparities as alleviate them. The sad truth reveals itself in a mountain of data, and let's begin by looking at slide 2. This slide, I hope you can see it, but what it shows, on the far left you have a representation of the educational attainment for a young cohort of adults, a 24 to 35-year-old crowd, and then people close to retirement. And the dark blue, or the light blue, shows the youngest generation. The dark blue shows the older generation. And you can see that in Texas, the older generation is slightly, but still better educated than our youngest generation of adults in Texas. And if you look at the United States, and if you look at the other states, you can see that the light blue is significantly higher than the dark blue, which shows that those states are doing a better job of improving educational attainment generation to generation. That is not the case in Texas. These This situation for Texas, in my mind, represents an abdication of the American dream, and there is no way to maintain a vibrant economy and a high quality of life if this continues to be the case. There are other powerful indicators that the American dream is in trouble in Texas and other states. The achievement gap between high and low-income students is at an all-time high. College-going rates for affluent students are above 70%. For low-income students, barely 50%. And although enrollment of poor students has increased, the percentage of low-income students in college has actually declined. And perhaps the most salient fact explaining these disparities is this. In 2015, the average net price of a university education in this country could easily equal 84% of the average annual income of families in the lowest income quartile. I've been citing national data, but the numbers are hardly more encouraging for Texas, which, by the way, has the largest population of poor young people in the United States after California. Which brings us to the Texas paradox of the moment. As any number of demographers and economists has pointed out, Texas has a very youthful population, which is likely to produce 75,000 more high school graduates in 2027 than it currently does. In contrast, California will experience a decline of about the same number of high school graduates in the same period of time. This is a huge, as any number of experts have pointed out, this is a huge economic advantage for Texas, but only if we educate these young people who are mostly poor and largely Latino. Next slide. In a report issued last year, the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce examined the changes in the American workforce from 2008 to 2016 as the U.S. pulled out of the Great Recession. This work, which is called America's Divided Recovery, which I urge all of you to read, found that, and this is astonishing, found that of the 11.6 million jobs created in that period, now remember, these are new jobs, not replacement jobs, that of the 11.6 million jobs created in that period, 11.5 million went to college-educated workers. The report argues that the vast majority of jobs that required only a high school diploma were replacement rather than new positions, which were largely in managerial and professional fields and typically required a baccalaureate. By 2025, the report concludes, 65% of all jobs in the United States will likely require a bachelor's degree. So the challenge for Texas is clear. We have to do a better job of educating this fast, very fast growing population, largely of Latinos. Here's the paradox. The population in Texas that is growing fastest is the portion of the population that is least well educated. Texas's higher education plan is a powerful and appropriate response to the changing nature of the U.S. economy and its job market. And once again, as the slide points out, we've got 4 components. 60 by 30 refers to our goal of making sure that 60% of our youngest cohort of adults has some form of post-secondary credential by 2030. We have a goal related to completion. We want to produce 550,000 graduates by the year 2030. We want all of our college completers to graduate with marketable skills, and we want to maintain student debt at current levels. This plan builds on the successes of closing the gaps, the previous higher education strategic plan for Texas. Let's take a look at where we are with 60 by 30 Texas. As you can see from this, our progress has been, and we're only a couple of years into the plan, so we can't really detect any trends. But so far, the progress has been incremental. If you look at the increase, I don't know if you can see these numbers, but if you look at the top line, you can see that we've improved college completion by 0.7% in 1 year. in order to reach our goals for 60 by 30 Texas, we have to improve by 1.3% every year. Look at the number in the middle of the chart, the Texas high school graduates enrolling in higher education. We've gone down, actually, in the 2 years that are being tracked here, 2015 and 2016, from 52.7 to 51.9. The reason that number is disturbing is that the high achieving states like Massachusetts and Minnesota and others have high school to college rates of somewhere in the high 60s. There are a couple of states that have college going rates above 70%. You've heard me say over and over again that the story of Texas is we're getting better, but we're not getting better fast enough. And once again, I underscore that we have to improve 1.3 percentage points a year to reach our 60% completion goal. Right now, with about 52% of our high school graduates going to college, we won't come anywhere close to achieving the goals of 60 by 30 of Texas. We have to take into account that we're going to have to focus on low-income students, as I mentioned a moment ago, and the challenge of low-income students, as all of you know, is that low income typically correlates with going to less successful schools. This next chart shows you exactly what our challenges are. This is a survey or examination of an 8th grade cohort. We took the latest eighth grade cohort for which we have data, the 2005 group, and then we take them out 11 years, 1 year to finish the 8th grade, 4 years to finish high school, and 6 years to finish some form of post-secondary credential. And you can see that out of 100 8th graders, we only graduate 21 from some form of post-secondary program. And if you look even more closely, I know you can't see this from the back of the room, but if you look at those bars, the blue and the yellow bars describe the results for high-income and low-income students. And you can see that as you go deeper into the pipeline, the disparity between high-income and low-income students becomes more dramatic. And you can see that by the end of the 11-year period, we only graduate about 11%, 10% of low-income students. What is significant about that number is it is socioeconomic status that is the biggest predictor of educational attainment. It's not ethnicity, it's not race, it's income, family income. The numbers for African American students are about 13% are completers. For Latino students is about 14%, but for low-income students of any background, the completion rate is about 10%. Once students arrive on our campus, and you can see that the numbers are quite low. Once students arrive on our campus, we have to do a better job of making sure that they make it to completion. We're doing a much better job than we were 15 years ago. The completion rates, or the 6-year graduation rates for universities, were in the high 40s, maybe in some cases as high as 50%. For community colleges, the completion rates were in the low 20s. And now, in 2017, our completion rates have gone way up. Our 6-year graduation rates for our universities are right around 59%, which once again represents a 10-year improvement of about 10%. Our completion rates, or I should say success rates, for community colleges, which means either an associate's degree or completion of a certificate or a transfer to university, are somewhere in the low to mid-30 range. Once again, that's a significant improvement of well over 10% compared to when we began closing the gaps in the year 2000. I want to point out something significant that we sometimes forget. One of the things I've been hearing over and over again, how are we going to reach the goals of 60 by 30 Texas, given the levels of support we're getting from the state right now? And I point out that in closing the gaps, our graduation goal was to produce 210,000 graduates by 2015. And I tell people that when I came home to Texas from all those years in California, time and time again I was approached by individuals who said that goal of 210,000 is way too ambitious, we'll never make it. The fact of the matter is that we exceeded that goal dramatically. We produced nearly 250,000 graduates by 2015, and I point out that we did it in a time of decreasing state support. Let me be very clear about this. I'm not suggesting that higher education leaders should not advocate strongly for higher levels of state support. I'm saying that educational success is not simply a function of resources, but of establishing priorities and being innovative with the resources we have. I think I speak for the coordinating board when I say that we believe that our number one priority in Texas is undergraduate education and producing undergraduate credentials. We have other important missions in our universities. We have a research mission, but in higher education in general, our primary responsibility is to produce more post-secondary credentials. Several weeks ago, I was speaking to a friend, and I was reminded of an observation by Peter Drucker. Some of you may remember him, the famous management consultant. He once noted that whatever you are producing at a given moment in time, in whatever field, is probably the best the current system can do. And he went on to say what you're getting is probably what you'll continue to get, more or less. And if you want to get dramatically better results, you need to innovate. I believe Drucker's observation very much applies to 60 by 30 Texas, which gets back to the title of my presentation. We can't get there from here. We can't get there doing business as usual. What I would like to do in the time I have left is discuss some innovations in higher education that might accelerate our progress in 60 by 30 Texas. Some of the innovations I will mention have been around a while but haven't been taken to scale. Some others will be controversial and difficult to implement. But remember, the question is, are we getting as much out of public higher education as the current system and structure will allow? And if so, we need to innovate. I thought I would start with a recommendation that all of you are familiar with, and we still haven't accomplished, at least in terms of universities, and that is to implement outcomes-based funding for universities. We have it in place now for community colleges. We have it in place for technical colleges, but we haven't implemented it for universities. And we are still supportive of the methodology that was developed by the Formula Funding Advisory Committee for general academic institutions before last session, which simply has two metrics: a metric for graduates in general and a second metric for graduates who are considered at risk. And our recommendation was that whatever the bonus is for graduation, that it be doubled for at-risk students. So if the bonus is $500 for a graduate, it's $1,000 for an at-risk student, presumably because those students require more attention and more academic support. It's time to get this done. I'm hopeful that the mood of the legislature will be supportive and we can get this implemented for every sector of higher education. The data that we have for community colleges, for technical colleges, is positive. And the data from the national sector, where outcomes-based funding has been implemented, as you can see from the slide, at least 33 states have adopted outcomes-based funding. We know enough about how to do it to make sure we do it right. And one of the principal recommendations of the states that have done it is keep the metrics simple. And that's what we are proposing to do. The next slide shows something else that you've heard people at the coordinating board talk about, and that is that we need to develop stronger partnerships among public education, higher education, and the third element is the workforce. The Workforce Commission, in the case of the Higher Education Coordinating Board, as an agency, but we can also develop stronger relationships among these three sectors at the regional and local levels. I don't know if many of you have been following his work, but I've been looking very closely at the work of a young and brilliant economist named Raj Chetty, Chetty. Anybody know his work? He's an economist at Stanford, and he's won every prize that's available for economists under 40. And he is conducting, along with several colleagues, one at Harvard, one at Berkeley, one in Paris, he's conducting the largest survey, the largest study ever done in this country on social mobility. And one of the things that stuck out from their preliminary work, and you can Google Chetty on, and you can find the PowerPoint slides from his presentations. He has found, he and his partners have found that education in the primary grades is the most important, or is one of the 5 most important factors in determining whether poor children will have social mobility. What is striking about his work is that it shows that the preparation, adequate, strong academic preparation in the primary grades, K through 3, has a bigger impact than whatever happens throughout the educational pipeline. That your fate as a student is pretty much sealed by what happens to you in the first 3 grades. And so he strongly advocates for making sure that we have good elementary schools in every community in this country. We need to work more closely with K through 12 to improve college and career readiness. It has to start in the high schools, and it has to be done well. I'm a little bit concerned. I'm more than a little bit concerned. I'm very concerned about some of the early studies that have shown that there's been a slippage in college readiness in Texas in the past several years. I think we need to collaborate more closely with the Texas Workforce Commission and with local workforce groups to make sure that we are preparing students for the jobs that not only exist now, but will exist in the foreseeable future. We mentioned Coastal Bend College there. They've created an extraordinary nursing pathway that makes it accessible, affordable, and achievable, and it meets the expectations of 60 by 30 quite well. You'll hear more about this tomorrow. Next slide. We need to focus on cost efficiencies. It's very clear that we become more cost efficient in Texas higher education over the last 15, 20 years, but we still have a long way to go. These are some of the areas in which we obviously need to make improvement. We need to reduce the number of attempted semester credit hours that students take towards getting some form of credential. Right now in Texas, the average number of hours attempted by a community college student to acquire an associate's degree is close to 90. It was 90, and it's dipped just a bit in the past couple of years, but it's right at 90. It's the highest in the country. In our universities, the average number of credit hours attempted to achieve a bachelor's degree is right under 140. We were above 140 a couple of years ago. So we're making progress, but once again, we're not making progress fast enough. The fact of the matter is that if we meet our semester credit hour targets, we will save the state and families hundreds of millions of dollars. And sometimes it's nothing more than a case of bad advising or absence of advising. And there have been studies and there have been institutions that have come forward and said the money that we put into extra advising to make sure that all of our students are on track to accumulate the least number of hours they need to get a degree, that all of the money we put into that, we recovered through the retention of students and by moving them through the system more quickly. It's something we can readily do. It's fixable primarily with better, more consistent advising. There are a lot of other things that we can do. Obviously, the transfer process is very cost inefficient. We don't give students information about the difference between courses that transfer and courses that count towards a degree. We have to do a better job of that. We have to compel students by whatever means possible to take 30 hours a year, if possible. That doesn't mean you necessarily take 15 and 15. You can do 12, 12, and 6. You can do 12, 15, and 3. But we need to get as many students as possible to complete 30 hours a year. That will save tons of money both to the state and to the families. Imagine if we could reduce the length of time to the bachelor's degree from 4.8 years, 4.9 years to 4. Thousands of dollars of savings to the family and to the state. The one point I want to make in this particular regard is we have, and some of you have heard me say this before, we are expanding academic programs in Texas faster than the legislature is either willing or able to support appropriately. Unless we put a brake on the expansion of programs, we are going to dilute the limited resources we have still more, and that's a certain recipe for statewide mediocrity. I am advocating strongly for all institutions to focus on improving existing programs rather than expanding new ones, with the only exception being that there is a dramatic, demonstrable need for a new academic program in a given region or community. We have, frankly, we have an awful lot of mediocre academic programs in Texas. And it makes sense that instead of making the likelihood of mediocrity even greater, it makes sense that we focus on strengthening the programs we have before we propose new ones. Next slide. This simply, okay. This I think is one of the most important things we have to do. We need to reinvent financial assistance. I think that it's pretty clear at the federal level and the state level, the Pell programs and the Texas grant programs are unsustainable at their current rates of growth. I don't think we can count on the state to raise the amount of money that's put into Texas grant, $40–50 million every year, every biennium. As you know, there's already been a good deal of discussion at the federal level to cut back the size of the Pell program. I think we're going to have to supplement what we do with grant aid with other means of financial support. For me, the most promising area that we can move into is once again working with the business community, with the workforce community to create vastly more paid internships. I don't like unpaid internships. They're grossly unfair to poor kids. They have to work. They have to earn income to make their way through college. So without all internships being paid, what happens is the ones that go to those internships and get into those networks that help them find a job after college and help them acquire the marketable skills they need to get those jobs, go to kids who are affluent. And once again, 60% of the students coming through the K-12 pipeline in this state are poor. We need to we need to think about expanding work-study programs, off-campus work-study programs, where once again students work in business settings, they acquire invaluable marketable skills, and they're paid jointly by the employer and by the institution. I know that there are some administrative problems. I know there's some liability issues. Work-study programs reported to me when I was on a campus, but it can be done. I would also argue that the way that we could make internships and work-study really successful is if we found ways to tie academic credit to those kinds of activities. If somebody is working as an engineering intern at Texas Instruments and is actually majoring in engineering, I think we ought to be able to find ways to give the student academic credit for some of the work he or she is doing at a place like Texas Instruments. And once again, here's an example of the Texas Tech University Red to Black Financial Literacy Program. It focuses on making sure that students know what their options are. It makes them aware of the need to think about paying back their debt early. It makes them aware of about the benefits they can get at particular kinds of jobs that would help them pay off their debt once they're in the workforce. Next slide. Competency-based education. This is something we've been pushing particularly in graduate program proposals, most particularly in professional fields like education and engineering. We ought to be able to shorten the length of time, all the while accumulating debt that it takes graduate students to finish a program. If you're a principal, for example, there should be an awful lot of experience that you've acquired while being a principal that should count towards the acquisition of an EDD. Same thing in other fields. Same thing, and we've made some progress in this area, giving college credit to veterans. We need to make sure that we give students credit for the work that they do, the work that they've done, and we need to make certain that we advance students on the basis of the mastery of knowledge rather than seat time. It will take a lot of work to develop competency-based exams, competency-based benchmarks to make sure that students are advancing at appropriate levels, but we ought to be able to find ways to advance students at whatever pace they want to move based on the mastery of material rather than seat time. This is something we've been pushing very hard, and frankly, a lot of institutions have been dragging their feet. And I know that in some cases it's a matter of faculty not wanting to do the work that's involved in moving to a competency-based structure rather than a semester-based structure. We would urge you to take a look for the university representatives in the room to take a look at the Texas Affordable Baccalaureate Initiative that we've launched. We now have 6 universities and community colleges that are offering these programs. These programs deliver baccalaureates for less than the average cost of a typical baccalaureate, which is around $35,000. These degree programs typically come in around $13,000, $15,000. They create another pathway for affordability. The coordinating board just received a $1 million grant from the Dell Foundation so that we can provide matching funds for institutions that want to create their own affordable baccalaureate programs. We urge you to think about this and to submit your applications. We've got an excellent model right now. It's listed there, Texas A&M Commerce, which worked with South Texas College to be the first two institutions in the state that offered these affordable baccalaureates. Next slide. Marketable skills in the liberal arts, a point that we've been making over and over and over again. We've been accused by any number of faculty from universities and both community colleges that we're turning our colleges and universities into trade schools. No, we're not seeking to do that, but we are seeking to respond to the number one reason that students go to college, to get a better job. They can't do that if they don't have marketable skills. I've pointed out that in some cases, it's nothing more than explaining to students what their marketable skills are. I had an English professor when I went to school here many years ago who would tell every class that he taught, if you can write well, you can get a job. And I remembered that when I graduated and I moved to California and I applied the very next day for a job as a technical writer in a big aerospace company in the Los Angeles area. And I did that strictly on the basis of this advice from that professor. Now, obviously, it's oftentimes much more complicated than that. We don't do a very good job across the board of embedding marketable skills in the humanities and the social sciences, but we have to do that. We have to honor the reason that students go to college. And that's one of the primary complaints that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. The feeling that among so many Americans that college is not worth the cost because we don't do a good job of getting students ready for the workforce. Now, this is a criticism, of course, that's much more directed at universities as opposed to two-year institutions. But it's something that we have to address. Finally, or not finally, but in regard to students, we've got to do a better job of delivering student services in an intrusive way. I tell people, some of you have heard me say this, that there are two great myths in higher education that get us in a lot of trouble, and if we in fact address them, we would solve a lot of our problems. The first great myth is that in the 3-month period between graduating high school and landing on a college campus, students are magically transformed into adults. So we don't take roll, and we know that when you do take roll, that retention goes way up. We don't tell students you need to go to tutoring. We just tell them there's tutoring available if you think you need it. Very few students think they do. We don't do new student orientations the way we used to. We need to go back to that and tell students what their expectations are. We need to expand summer bridge programs, both for transfer students and incoming first-year students. We need to encourage students' success by embracing available tools, student data. We have more data on students than any other state. Use it. Make decisions about how to transfer resources, establish new priorities, do things differently. We need to improve developmental education. Let me give you a particularly vexing issue that I've been talking about as long as I've been here. When I first came here, I really didn't know a lot about developmental education. But I noticed that reading and writing was divided into two separate courses at most institutions, primarily community colleges. And I would tell people, I said, well, you know, I've spent most of my career as an English professor, and I know one thing about English courses. You read a text and then you write about the text. And it makes no sense cognitively, pedagogically, except in the most extreme cases where students essentially can't read at all, to separate reading and writing into two different courses. That is still the pattern in our developmental ed programs in Texas. We made some progress. We made dramatic progress. I think I heard recently that about 40% of English developmental education is integrated now. It should be close to 100%. You can eliminate 1/3 of developmental ed if you combine reading and writing into one course. Another issue that I've talked a lot about, it's well-intentioned, but it's not the best solution to the challenge. For example, we've had a lot of institutions in Texas create success courses. And they have had a positive impact in many, many cases. But you're adding another course to the course load that students have to complete. And secondly, and I've seen this happen in a lot of places around the country, is that when you create success courses, the faculty in the other courses say, well, I don't have to focus on that because that's being done in that one particular course. All of our entry-level, lower division courses in higher education ought to be success courses. Every faculty member ought to tell his or her students what they need to do to be successful in that particular class. I remember at UCLA in the 70s, we wanted to create a women's studies program. And we did. And we got about 15 faculty to promise to commit to teach one course in women's study every year. And we said this is a step in the right direction. You know what happened? The actual number of courses at UCLA with women's studies content went down because all the faculty who were teaching American literature courses or teaching sociology courses, they said, I don't have to do a women's component anymore because that's what those courses are intended to do. All courses, particularly entry-level courses, should be success courses. It shouldn't be relegated to one particular course or one particular set of faculty. That should be every faculty member's primary responsibility. We need to make these changes quickly. I tell people that by the end of the next session, we're going to be almost 1/3 of the way through 60 by 30 Texas. And lastly, I wanted to talk about the involvement of faculty. Here's a second great myth in higher education that gets us in a lot of trouble. By virtue of getting a PhD, you know how to teach. There has been dramatic improvement in retention rates in institutions around the country that have implemented a professional development program for all new faculty. To introduce them to cognitive science, or as they're called in some places, learning sciences, or the teaching sciences. For example, most faculty members know nothing about memory, how memory works. And the one thing I can tell you for sure about the work, the reading I've done in memory, is that drill and kill doesn't help you remember things better. Faculty need to know those things. There's so many things that they can do. I mentioned some already. Take roll. If a student is in trouble, call him or her in and say, we need to talk about how you can improve your grades instead of letting them sink or swim on their own. There are things that have worked phenomenally in some places. One university got a double-digit improvement in retention by doing one thing. They required faculty to hold office hours immediately after class. When the questions were fresh in the students' minds, the students were right there with the faculty members, so they didn't have to worry about 2 days later, should I go see this guy? I don't think so. It's not necessary that everything that we do will cost a lot of money. And then finally, the thing that we have to do is, and this is probably the most controversial issue for universities, is we have to use all three elements of the faculty reward system. We know that we know that in universities the most important thing is research, and it's understandable why that's the case. It's a lot easier to quantify than excellence in teaching. But we need to make sure that professors know that they have a responsibility to be successful in the classroom. I can tell you, I was, my department assigned, it was a very good idea, assigned faculty mentors, senior faculty as mentors to first-year assistant professors. And I had one at UCLA, took me out to dinner. We spent 4 hours over dinner. He didn't mention students once, not once. All he talked about is, this is what you're going to have to do to get tenured. You're going to have to write this. You're going to have to publish here. You're going to have to. Didn't mention students once. And that happens more often than it should. We have got to establish criteria. For example, my faculty handbook read that the one indispensable criterion for advancement was superior intellectual performance, superior intellectual achievement. If you can demonstrate superior intellectual attainment in teaching, in public service, why not say, instead of having to submit 25 articles for tenure, you can submit 15. Same quality as we expected before. But if you can show superior intellectual attainment in teaching and service, why not? We're going to have to take those kinds of significant innovations into account if we're going to reach the goals of 60 by 30 Texas. Thank you very much.